Segmenting 101 by Richard Spencer. Now, segmenting opens up a whole new world of possibilities for lathe work. There's some absolutely beautiful pieces that are being made by people all over the world. Some of them are not even round. Some of them are highly themed. Some of them are very complicated. Some are just plain beautiful. But each day, people are coming up with new ways to segment. And it's just a very exciting form of woodworking. Now, to get started in segmenting, you need first to pick the form you want to build. You have to know what you're going to build before you start. Then you have to pick the wood that you want to use for that piece. You choose the number of segments. You have a lot of possibilities. So you have to decide on which one you're going to do. Then you lay out the ring. Then you cut the segments for that ring. Then you glue up all of the rings. And then you have to glue the rings together. Then you turn the piece. Now we will look at each one of these in detail. The first thing you have to do is pick a form. You have to know in advance what you're going to turn. So you lay out that shape in advance on paper. Now in this demo, we're going to use this form. It's just going to be a simple bowl shape that'll be easy to turn and easy to lay out. The next thing you do is pick the wood. You have a lot of leeway in what wood you pick, but it needs to be very dry and very stable. The best wood you can pick for segmenting is the kiln-dried wood. Now for this demo, we'll use curly maple for the bowl, and it's going to have a babinga and curly maple rim. Then you have to pick the number of segments. You can pick 6, 8, 10, 12, all the way up as high as you want to go. I've seen bangle bracelets that had 96 segments per ring. Now for this demo, we're going to use 12 segments per inch. And that means that I'll need to cut a 15-degree angle on each one of the segments, on each end. Now, if you pick a different number of segments, you will have a different angle. Then you lay out your rings. Once you have the form that you want to turn, now we know this is what we're going to turn. You lay out the rings. Now it's very important that you lay out these rings where you can actually see where they're going to intersect the form. We know that rings 1, 2, and 3 are going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. Ring 4 is going to be 1/4 inch thick. But we need to know where they intersect the form so we can take measurements. You just mark where they land. Now, length, width, and thickness are interchangeable in some circles, but not so much in segmenting. Thickness, length, and width are very specific when it comes to segmenting. The thickness is always a vertical dimension. When you're looking at the piece sitting on a table and you see the thickness of each ring, it's vertical. It's measured vertically. Now, in segmenting, you have two lengths. There's an outside length and an inside length. The outside length is always the longer of the two. And it's measured around the piece. it's around the circumference. So it's measured as part of a circle that goes all the way around the outside. Now, width is measured radially. It's measured from the center line of the piece to the outside. So the thickness is vertical, the length is around the circumference, and the width is from the center out. Once you understand where these occur, then it's much easier. You don't want to get these confused. If you confuse width and length, you can wind up with a ring that you can't use. It's not going to fit in the piece that you're trying to turn. So they're very important to get a real clear understanding of what they are and what they represent. Now, to establish the outside radius for ring number 1, we need to add 5/16 to the outside of the bowl. Now, how we do that is the red lines indicate ring number 1. Now, if you go across the top of ring number 1, when you get to where the line intersects the form, that's where you want to turn it down to. But you need a little extra material. So you add 5/16 of an inch along that line outside of the form. And then when you measure that, you get 3 9/30. So now you know the outside radius for ring number 1. Now, to lay out the rings, you can do it on a computer. It's how I do it. But you can also use a simple paper jig. Since we're doing 12 segments, you just draw 2 lines. They join down here, and they're 30 degrees apart. So if you just lay out this on a simple piece of paper, you can lay out the segments for each ring actually quite easily. Now, what you need on that first ring is that 3 9/30 that we talked about earlier. You already know what that is. So you can go to your paper jig and you can lay out the 2 legs because you know the dimension now. You just measure between the 2 lines to find the length. And you measure top to bottom to find the width. So it works kind of like this. You start at the bottom, and you're going to measure up this outside line, the 3 9/30. You're going to do the same thing on the other leg, up to 3 9/30. Now, up here where the lines end, you just draw a line from that point to that point. Then you can measure it, and it comes out to 1 11/16. So that's your width, your length. Now the width is measured from the point down here all the way up. And this is your width. And that's going to be 3 5/30. So you now have all of the measurements that you need to lay out the segments for ring number 1. And this is what ring number 1 would look like. Each length, the outside length, is 1 11/16. And that's going to be the same for each one of these segments all the way around. Now the width is the 3 5/30. And that's measured from all the way down here at the center up to here. So it gives you the width and the length. Now, when I'm laying out the rings, I use a paper table to record all of these dimensions. And as you can see, we had the 3 and 9/32 for our outside radius. There was no inside radius because it went all the way to the center. Our thickness is 3/4 of an inch. The width is 3 and 5/32, and our outside length is 1 and 11/16. Now these are the two dimensions that we determined from our paper jig. Now the inside length it doesn't have because it goes all the way to the center. And our blank length is 13 inches. Now I'll show you in just a minute how we determine this blank length. It helps to know how much wood it's going to take to cut all 12 of your segments out of the same piece of wood. So that's how you do it with the blank length. Now the blank length uses a formula. It's the outside length plus the inside length plus 1/4 of an inch multiplied by 6. And that equals the blank length. Now when we actually do the math, we take our outside length, which is 1 inch and 11/16. Then we add the inside length, and in this case it's 0 because that ring number 1 went all the way to the center, so it has no inside length. Now we add the 1/4 of an inch. This 1/4 of an inch is for the kerf on the saw that you're going to cut the segments with. I use an 1/8 inch thick blade on a table saw, and I make 2 cuts per segment, so that's 1/4 of an inch. Then I multiply that by 6, and that equals 11 and 5/8. Now I always round up to the next inch, and then I add an inch. So if we do it that way, we take the 11 and 5/8, round it up to 12, add an extra inch, and that equals the 13. So that's how I come up with the blank length for each one of the rings that we're going to cut. Now ring 2 is a little bit different because it will have an inside radius and an inside length. But it's done very similarly. We take our long side of ring number 2, where it intersects the form, we add the 5/16 of an inch. So that's exactly the same on all of the rings on the outside. We add the 5/16. Now this one adds this 1/4 inch measurement here, where the bottom of ring 2 intersects the form. We subtract 1/4 of an inch. This gives us extra material on the inside so that we've got enough material so that when we start turning it away and we turn to the form, that we have enough material to actually shape this particular form out of what we're cutting. So we'll measure from the center to that 1/4 inch mark, and that'll give us 2 and 5/16. Now on the upper side, it's the same thing. We measure from the center out to the 5/16, and that gives us 3 and 11/16. So we now have all of the measurements that we need to lay out ring number 2. And that's by adding the 5/16 to the outside and subtract the 1/4 inch from the inside. Now, when we go to lay it out on our paper form, we're going to measure up the 2 legs with the inside and outside radius. We'll measure between them to get the inside and outside length, and we'll measure between the lines to get the width, and it will look something like this. Again, we start down at the bottom where the lines meet, And we're going to measure our outside radius, which was 3 11/16 up to here. We're also going to measure up the 2 5/16 that was our inside radius. And we'll do the same thing on this side with the 3 11/16 and the 2 5/16. Now, when we draw lines between those lines, there and there, and we measure them, it gives us 1 29/32 for the outside length, 1 3/16 for the inside length. Now, when we measure between the two lines, that gives us our width. That's 1 11/32. And in red is the actual shape of the segment for ring number 2. Now, we'll take all of these measurements that we just made and we'll transfer to the table. So now you can see for ring number 2, that was our inside and outside radius. We know that our thickness is going to be 3/4 of an inch. We know the width is going to be 1 11/32. The outside length is 1 29/32. That inside length is 1 3/16. Now, when you do the math with that formula, you'll come up with a blank length of 22 inches. Now, ring 3 is done very much like ring 2. We're not going to go through all of the explanations, but you have subtracted the 1/4 inch and you have added the 5/16. You do that consistently with every ring. 5/16 on the outside, 1/4 inch on the inside. And you lay them out the same way. You would do your outside radius, your inside radius, draw the lines, measure the outside, the inside, and the width. And in red is the actual shape of the segment for ring number 3. And like I said, it's done the same way. Now we'll update the table. And that's all of our measurements for ring number 3. And we wind up with a blank length of 25 inches. Now, ring number 4 is so close in size to ring number 3 that we're just going to duplicate it. The only difference is it's going to have a 1/4 inch thickness instead of 3/4. And there's our updated table. For ring number 4. And it's a 1/4 inch thick, 1 1/2, 2 9/32, and 1 15/32. And it has the same blank length of 25 inches. Now, the method I use is just one of many. There's lots of different ways to calculate rings. There's manual and computer aids available. The computer aids include programs like Woodturner Pro, Lamination Pro, and 3D Design Pro. The manual aids include things like the Cassinger template and the Seg-Easy plate. There's lots and lots of different methods. And if you find that one of these other methods work better for you, then use it. What's illustrated in this program is simply what I do. And that's not necessarily the best way for you. Now, our next thing is in the line is to cut the segments. Now, before we cut the segments, we need to prepare the blanks for each ring. Now, we've figured out from our chart that for ring number 1, it needs to be 3/4 thick, 3 5/32 in width, and 13 inches long. So we just have to do the same thing for rings number 2, 3, and 4. We know the thickness, the width, and the blank length for each one of them from our chart. Now you have to cut the correct number of segments from each blank. In this case, it's 12. Now, the method and the saw that you use is up to you. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You have to do it with your own equipment. You just have to make sure that each angle that you cut is exact. Close is simply not good enough. If you've got 12 segments, you're making 24 cuts. If you have just a very small amount of error in your setup and you cut those 24 cuts, you have multiplied whatever error you had to begin with by 24. And that's going to produce a gap between your segments. They're not going to all touch for their full length. There will be a gap somewhere in your glue up for those 12 segments. Now, I built a sled that I put on my table saw. It looks kind of like this. It does one thing and one thing only. It cuts 15-degree angles, but it cuts perfect 15-degree angles. Now, this is what a real segment would look like for ring 1. Now, our next thing that we're going to have to do is actually glue up the rings. Now, once you have all of your segments cut and dry fit, then you clamp them in a hose clamp. They would look something like that. But you have to have a way to hold your wood together. Clamping 12-sided segment rings is difficult. I find that the hose clamps do a very, very good job of putting an adequate amount of pressure on all of them to get a good glue joint on all 12 segments and to keep them aligned. Now, if you have some segments that don't fit perfectly, there is a cheat that you can use. You use half dowels. And what you actually do here is you glue up these 6, and then you glue up these 6. But in between, you put a half dowel. And then you put your clamp on it, and you're gluing up half rings. Now, once you get the half rings glued up and they're dry, you take the clamp off, and then you use a straight edge and you sand all the way across so that you get, and you're sanding both sides of your ring at the same time on a flat surface. And that will make that line flat all the way across, and the same for this side. And then when you glue the 2 pieces together, the fit is going to be perfect. So you can get gapless rings, even from segments that aren't cut perfectly. Now, once all your rings are glued up, they have to be flattened top and bottom. Now, I use a power thickness sander, but you can use what I call a Norwegian steam-powered sander if you don't happen to have a thickness sander. Now, my thickness sander looks like this, and all I have to do is put the ring on a conveyor belt. It goes through the machine. The belt on the inside sands it smooth. Now, the Norwegian steam-powered sander is nothing but a piece of MDF with sandpaper glued to it. And you simply hold it down and move it back and forth on the sandpaper until it is flat. Now, once you get all of your rings glued up, then you have to glue the rings together. There are two challenges to getting the rings glued up properly. You have to get them concentric. They all have to be on the same center line. And then you have to get the vertical joints lined up. You have to have radial alignment as well. Now, missing either by much will hurt the look of the piece, and it can cause serious turning problems. So I've worked out a method that only requires a chuck on the headstock, an adapter, and jumbo jaws on the tailstock. Now, it's if you already have the equipment, then it's not that big a deal. But you need a chuck on your headstock. This is called a reverse chucking adapter. It has a number 2 Morse taper on one end, and it has threads on the other. Now, these threads fit your chuck. So you would put this in your tailstock, and then you would take your second chuck with the jumbo jaws, and you would screw that onto the reverse chucking adapter. And that gives you a chuck on your headstock and a chuck with jumbo jaws on your tailstock. And then you would put a sacrificial piece. In this case, mine is 2.5 inches square in the chuck on the headstock. And you take your number 1 ring, which would be the bottom of your bowl, and you put that onto your jumbo jaws on the tailstock. Now, you'll also notice that there are only 4 of the buttons. I've taken 4 of them off. You're only holding this in place. You're not actually going to turn it from here. Plus, you have a 12-sided object, and 12 is not divisible by 8, but it is divisible by 4. So you're better off if you take half of your buttons off and just do this with the 4. Now, you have to glue the ring number 1 to the sacrificial block. It's a very simple thing. Your headstock and tailstock are on the same center line. So when you bring up that number 1 ring and glue it to the sacrificial in the headstock, you're automatically centered. So you don't have to worry about that. Now, when you set up and glue the ring number 2, you simply back the jumbo jaws off the number 1 ring, readjust it, put the number 2 ring on it, and bring it up. But there's one other thing that you have to be careful of. If you see right here, we have the joint line between 2 segments. That has to be centered on the segment in ring number 2. So this joint has to be on the center line of this segment. And it makes it look like a block wall. Each row is offset by 50% in a block wall. And you need the same appearance in your segmenting, or it's going to look funny. And like I say, you have to line it. Now, gluing up ring 3 and 4 is done in exactly the same manner. You just back the jumbo jaws up, put the next ring on it, apply the glue, bring it up, set the radial alignment, and put pressure. Now, when you're doing this, you don't have to let each ring dry completely. You can just let it set for about 5 minutes. All it has to do is tack up so it won't move. So you can actually glue all 4 of these up in about 20 minutes or so. You just let it set for about 5 minutes, take it, remove the jumbo jaws, put the new ring in there, apply the glue, put the second one up, align it, put the pressure, let it set for 5 minutes, take it loose, put the next ring. So you can actually add a ring every 5 minutes as you assemble your project. Now, once it's glued up, it's time to turn the bowl. Now, once the glue dries and you remove the jumbo jaws, you're actually ready to turn. You just get everything out of the way on the tailstock, and the headstock is already set up. You have all 4 rings glued together to a sacrificial already attached to your chuck. All you have to do is turn it. And you do that. You turn the outside of the bowl first, get that outside shape, and then you, from the same setup, you just move to the inside, turn the inside shape, and you follow all of the same rules that you do for turning any bowl. So you get your shape inside and out, and then do your finish sanding. You would do the majority of the sanding now, both inside and out. And then you'll use your jumbo jaws again. You remove the bowl from the chuck and you mount the rim of the bowl in the jumbo jaws, and then you turn off that sacrificial that you had in the chuck. You'll just turn that off completely. And I like to put an O-ring in the bottom of most of the work that I do. And this is where I would cut the groove for the O-ring. So if you plan to put an O-ring in your bowl, this is where you would actually cut the groove. And it's a simple thing. You just pick the O-ring you're going to use, and you cut a groove in the bottom of your bowl that will accept that O-ring. It's not a difficult thing to do. And then you just apply the finish that you want. On a bowl like this, I normally use a lacquer finish, and then I polish that lacquer. But you could use wipe-on poly. You could use butcher block. There's all kinds of finishes that you could put on it. It's just whatever you choose. And then just enjoy your bowl. And this is the end.